In the frozen Montana pines, veteran forester Ethan Miller wakes to find himself tied tightly to a tree, unable to move. He has no idea who did it. Yet what chills him more is the heavy footfall drawing closer through the dark. From the shadows, a massive mother grizzly emerges, her amber eyes fixed on him. Ethan believes his final moment has come, until the bear does something no one on Earth would ever expect. Twilight settled over the Montana pines like a quilt laid by a careful hand, and the forest grew so still that even the needles seemed to hold their breath. Ethan Miller came back to himself 1 inch at a time. First, the tightness in his chest, then the rasp of rope against his wrists, finally the cold spike of understanding. He was tied to a ponderosa, cinched to the bark with loops that bit into muscle and bone. His cheeks stung where sap had glued grit to skin. When he tried to pull free, pain ran hot across his ribs, and the world steadied into the hard fact that somebody wanted him to disappear into this quiet. He listened. Far off, a creek talked to itself. Closer, a jay scolded and went silent. A dull weight of footsteps pressed the earth, heavy and unhurried, breaking branches with the confidence of a thing that never moved aside for anything. The steps stopped. The air thinned. She stepped out of the shadows, like a door opening. A grizzly, full-shouldered and scarred, her coat the color of winter wheat where the light touched it and dark as wet earth where it didn't. Her head was low, eyes the warm tarnish of old brass. Ethan felt his heartbeat in his throat, the way a man hears a train before he sees it. He had spent 2 decades walking boundaries and easing trouble from the wild, and still the size of her made the tree at his back feel small. She rose onto her hind legs, tall as a porch roof, and for a breath the world hung between 2 endings. He shut his eyes, not out of surrender, but to protect the last square inch of himself from the vision of it. Her paw came down with a thud that rattled the bark. The rope at his shoulder jumped, tightened, then eased as if some expert had struck a knot exactly where it needed striking. He opened his eyes. She wasn't on him. She was over him, past him, working the line that held him. She hooked a claw beneath the hemp and worried at it with small, precise motions, the way a seamstress might tease thread from cloth. Her breath reached him, warm and musky. When the fiber refused to give, she lowered her head and tested it with her teeth. The rope snapped back against the trunk with a sound like a plucked bass string. She chuffed, vexed, and tried again. Ethan didn't trust miracles, but he knew the shape of one. He swallowed. The sap in the bark smelled a little like vanilla. His mind, searching for any place to land, caught on a glint along her shoulder. A pale crescent where hair lay thin over rough skin. Not a hunter's mark, not some new wound, older. He knew that crescent. Snow remembered it. So did the faint scar on his own thumb, where a frantic yearling had tried to nip the needle out of his hand while he cut open a steel jaw trap. He had carried that little bear through a night that wouldn't end. Heat pads and glucose, and the hush of a man alone with a life that didn't speak his language. 2 weeks later, she had disappeared into a seam of trees, just another shadow in a world of them. Now the shadow had a face he knew. She paused as if she had heard him think it. One round ear tipped in his direction. Her eyes met his, steady, measuring. There was no romance in them, no storybook kindness. There was attention, and a decision being made without hurry. She placed her teeth deeper against the rope and pulled. The knot creaked. Ethan shifted, trying to give her slack, and the bark scored his shoulder. The hemp burned his wrists. He welcomed it. Pain meant the world had edges again. Somewhere beyond the clearing, brush whispered. It was not the clumsy rumor of wind. It was a body moving with care. The bear's head flicked toward the sound, then back to the rope, as if weighing that distant rustle on a scale he could not see. Ethan couldn't turn to look, but he felt the prickle of being watched by something quick and bright-eyed just inside the scrub, there and not there, a question the woods would ask later. The forest held the note. The grizzly shifted her stance, setting one forepaw flat against the trunk just above his shoulder, the other bracing the ground. The pressure of her weight vibrated through the tree into his spine, an odd comfort for a trapped man, like leaning against a living furnace. She opened her jaws and bit down, not in a snap, but in a careful crush. Fibers popped. The loop across his ribs loosened a fraction, enough for a shallow breath that didn't scrape. "Easy," he said, the word no louder than a thought escaping. His voice surprised him. It sounded like a stranger's, dry and far away. She didn't flinch at the sound, only worked more intently, the muscles along her neck sliding under the pelt. A jay called once, sharp as a nail, and went quiet again. The steps in the brush arranged themselves into position, or so it seemed. The sense of that unseen thing lingered like a hand on the back of his neck. It wasn't threat yet, it was possibility. The rope gave another inch. Feeling returned in pins and needles to Ethan's fingers. He flexed them and felt the grit under his nails, the tacky drag of sap. The bear huffed, then angled her head, experimenting. When the knot refused to surrender by pulling, she struck at it with a hooked claw, tapping rather than slashing, blades of strength reduced to tools of patience. Bark clicked loose and skittered down his sleeve. A breeze moved at last, and the needles above answered with a soft, shivering hiss. With the wind came scents layered like old paper, iron of the creek, pitch of pine, the faint sweetness of crushed juniper, and under it all the rank ghost of tobacco and gun oil, human, recent. The knowledge lit up in him the way lightning sketches a ridgeline. He didn't need to see footprints to understand he wasn't alone with her. Whoever had tied him had not yet let the night take their work. The bear's ear rotated again, a radar dish tuned to an instrument he couldn't hear. She lowered herself to all fours, body between him and the opening in the trees where the smell rode in. Her breath slowed, then deepened. Not fear, not quite anger. A readiness. Even in that posture she reached back, took the rope in her teeth, and pulled once more. The loop at his ribs slipped. He sucked in air and tasted dust and cold and the edge of relief. A twig snapped in the undergrowth with the neat certainty of a finger breaking a pencil. The unseen watcher stilled. The grizzly didn't retreat. She spread her weight, claws dimpling the duff, and gave a low sound that rolled through Ethan like a drumbeat. The sound said what words couldn't, not yet. The forest listened. The sun was down now, leaving a pewter light behind the ridgeline. Ethan felt the evening settle into his bones. He thought, absurdly, of the thermos on the passenger seat of his truck, cooling coffee that would never be finished. He thought of the small brass tag on his belt that said he belonged to this land, and of how little that mattered under the eyes of a wild thing that owed nothing to anyone. Then he thought of a winter night, and a yearling bear with a crescent of hurt on her shoulder, and the thought steadied him more than any badge could. The rope had one good loop left in it, the kind that holds until it doesn't. She tested it, and knew the same truth. She leaned, pulled, and the fibers sang. Ethan shifted again, pressing his shoulder into the bark to gift the knot a fraction of slack. Pain flared clean and useful. The loop squealed against the trunk. Something in it failed with a small, decisive sigh. He did not fall free. Not yet. But the tree no longer owned his breath. He drew a fuller lungful and let it out slow, careful not to waste the moment. The grizzly's head turned toward the brush where the last snap had come from, then back to him, as if to say the decision had more pieces than he could count. From the near thicket, two bright points steadied and then vanished, the way eyes do when they accept your presence and choose not to declare themselves. The rustle moved away, not far, but enough. The forest resumed its vigil. The bear returned to the rope, and the night took one small step closer. Night settled fully over the pines, and the cold sharpened, as though the forest itself were drawing in a breath. Ethan felt that chill trickle down his spine, while the grizzly stayed anchored between him and whatever moved just beyond sight. The rope around his chest had loosened enough for him to breathe without the scrape of hemp, but he was still far from free. The bear lowered her head again, tested the knot with deliberate pressure, and for a moment the world was narrowed to her breath, the rasp of fiber and the faint crackle of needles shifting overhead. Then she paused. Her shoulder turned just enough for the light to brush against the pale arc beneath her fur. That old scar shone like a memory being tugged out of the dark. Ethan stared, and the winters between now and then folded together like stacked paper. That was the same jagged crescent left by the steel jaws of a trap he had pried open with numb fingers. He remembered the trembling body of the yearling, the way its heartbeat had fluttered against his jacket, and how it had fought to stand once the pressure was gone. He had carried her through a storm that night, unsure she would last till morning. But she had lived. And now she stood here, large enough to make mountains seem small. She looked at him with the steadiness of a creature who remembered pain, and who had not forgotten the hands that lifted her from it. Yet there was something else layered in her attention, an alertness too sharp for nostalgia. Her ear twitched at a distant rhythm, one Ethan couldn't hear. She angled her head, scenting the air. The musk of her coat reached him, but underneath it rode something sourer, metallic and stale, drifting along the wind in thin strands. He recognized it a second before the forest answered with a muffled snap. Tobacco. Gun oil. Footsteps with an intent that made the night feel smaller than the space they walked upon. The bear's body stiffened. She swung her weight, placing herself squarely in front of him. Ethan's throat tightened. Whoever had tied him up wasn't content to let the wilderness do their work. They were coming back to finish what they started. A shape emerged between the saplings, first a shoulder, then the dark line of a rifle barrel catching the faint silver of moonlight. "Hold up," a voice whispered, harsh as gravel. "Someone's with him." Another man appeared behind the first, and then a third. Their silhouettes moved with the loose confidence of those who believed no witness would survive the night. Ethan knew them, not by name, but by type. Poachers who had been cutting snares across the western ridge. Men he had confiscated traps from, fined, and warned until warnings meant nothing. They must have decided he'd become a problem that required a final kind of solution. "Is that a bear?" the taller one muttered. He squinted, tilting his head. "You kidding me? We leave him out here and he gets a babysitter?" The grizzly lifted her muzzle and let out a sound, not a roar, but a low, rolling vibration that spread through the clearing like thunder bedding down in the earth. The men fell silent. One gripped his rifle tighter. Another checked the safety with a twitch of his thumb. Ethan felt the air change. The bear did not retreat. She stepped forward instead, her weight settling into the ground as though she was driving stakes into the soil. The memory of her younger self, wounded, frightened, leaning into him for warmth, flashed across his mind. Now she stood as something else entirely, grown, scarred, and ready to decide what kind of danger was worth her anger. The shortest man spat into the dirt. "Doesn't matter. Shoot it off him if you have to. We can't leave loose ends." The bear's ears pinned flat. Her breath billowed white in the cold. She made a sound Ethan felt more than heard, a warning meant for creatures far less foolish than the ones stepping toward her now. A fourth noise joined the moment, a metallic clink, subtle but unmistakable. One of the poachers swung a heavy object from his pack and let it drop at his feet. A steel jaw trap, newly greased. Its metal teeth glinted under the moon like rows of eager smiles. Ethan's pulse hammered. They weren't just planning to kill him. They meant to take her too. A bear that had learned to trust a human was, to them, an asset to be handled. The grizzly shifted again, and her body blocked Ethan from the trap's view. She growled, a deeper, older sound, the kind that spoke of winters survived and cubs defended. Ethan felt the bark dig into his back as he straightened as much as the ropes allowed. He knew what was coming next, and the helplessness of it hollowed him out. The tall poacher raised his rifle. A thin beam of moonlight struck the barrel. A breath caught in the trees. Ethan tried to shout, but only a cracked whisper came out. The grizzly's eyes flicked toward him for the briefest breath, and something unspoken crossed between them, not in language, but in the clarity of mutual recognition. She had stood on the edge of death once with him. Tonight the roles had turned. The rifle cracked. The forest exploded into motion. The bear lunged before the sound had even finished rolling through the branches, her roar breaking the night open like lightning tearing a seam. Ethan flinched as the shot shattered bark inches above his shoulder. The poacher stumbled back, shocked at the force barreling toward him. He swung wildly, missing by a yard. The second man dove for the trap. The third circled wide, eyes locked on Ethan, who strained against the rope until fire raced across his ribs. Behind the chaos, the faint rustle he'd heard earlier came again. Closer now, more purposeful. Something small and quick moving just out of sight, waiting for a moment of its own. The clearing became a storm of noise and movement, but Ethan could see only the bear, Scar catching the moonlight as she threw her weight into protecting the one human the world had once allowed her to trust. The clearing erupted into a chaos that seemed too large for the narrow ring of pines holding it. The first gunshot still echoed when the grizzly struck the tall poacher like a freight car made of muscle and fury. He toppled backward, rifle flying from his grip, landing with a thud that silenced even the wind for a heartbeat. Ethan, still bound to the tree, felt the impact travel through the ground and up the trunk, rattling his teeth. The second poacher dove for the steel jaw trap he had dropped earlier. His hands shook as he pried it open, metal jaws stretching like a pair of hungry mouths. He kept glancing toward the bear's flanking side, timing her movement, planning to clamp her leg the moment she shifted her weight. The third man skirted wide, mindful of teeth and claws, circling toward Ethan with a look that chilled more deeply than the night air. Whatever the bear was to them, Ethan was unfinished business. The grizzly roared, the kind of sound that came from someplace older than language, a sound that stripped bravado from the men facing her. She lunged toward the trap wielder. He staggered back, dragging the trap with both hands as if trying to shield himself with the very thing meant to maim her. She swiped. The blow didn't land cleanly, but it sent him spinning into the ferns, breath punched from his chest. Ethan strained against the rope. Each twist burned new fire into his wrists, but weakness was worse than pain. He lifted his knee and pressed it against the loop binding his lower ribs, trying to shift it enough to buy himself some leverage. Bark scraped into his skin, warm with his blood. Every breath came short, sharp, stolen. A sudden rustle behind him made him freeze. Out from the brush stepped a shape small and slim-legged, its coat catching the faint moonlight like spilled silver. The mule deer stood trembling, ears thrust forward, its dark eyes fixed not on the bear, but on Ethan. Recognition sparked through him. This was the same deer he had rescued as a fawn, found starving beside a fallen fir after a winter storm. He had fed it warm milk for 2 days before its mother returned. He had thought of it often, but never imagined seeing it here, full grown, watching danger draw its lines around all of them. The deer took a tentative step forward, its hooves whispering through the dry needles. The third poacher, the one creeping toward Ethan, froze as the animal appeared before him. He hadn't expected another living witness, much less one bold enough to interrupt his advance. He swung his rifle toward it, cursing under his breath. "Don't you do it," Ethan whispered, powerless to intervene. The words didn't stop the man, but they stirred something in the deer. It sprang sideways just as the rifle fired, the shot tearing through air where its shoulder had been. And in that instant of misfire, the grizzly turned. She barreled toward the man with a momentum that seemed impossible for something so large. He shrieked, stumbling back, firing again. The bullet grazed her flank, tearing fur and skin, and she roared, a sound so raw Ethan felt it in his bones. She knocked the rifle from his hands, sending it spiraling into the brush, then reared up, casting her shadow over him. The second poacher managed to right himself, trap in hand. He lunged toward the bear's exposed hind leg, jaws of steel gaping wide. The deer, as if sensing the intent, darted between them. The trap snapped shut on empty air, missing both targets. The force of the misfire sent the man off balance. He fell with a cry, the trap clattering beside him. The grizzly twisted, striking with a forepaw so heavy it sent dirt flying in an arc. The man scrambled backward, dragging himself through pine needles and broken branches, too panicked to regain his footing. She didn't chase him. She turned instead to reposition herself squarely between Ethan and every threat still moving. For a moment, the clearing held its breath. One poacher lay unconscious or close to it. The second pushed himself along the ground, groaning. The third had retreated several paces, his courage thinned by the reality of a grizzly unwilling to yield. But danger hadn't passed. Not even close. The tall man who had been knocked down first began to stir, pulling himself toward the rifle lying a few yards away. Ethan saw the movement. He struggled harder, twisting at his waist. The rope groaned. A thread snapped. Pain flared hot across his side, but the give in the rope was real. Small, but real. The bark behind him cracked under the strain as he pushed his shoulder against it. The deer, still trembling, circled wide, watching everything with sharp attention. It wasn't fighting, not truly, but it was disrupting, distracting, altering angles and timing in ways the poachers couldn't predict. It wasn't built for battle, yet its presence reshaped the fight, just enough to keep Ethan alive. The tall poacher reached the rifle. His fingers curled around the stock. He rolled onto one knee, bracing himself, aiming squarely at the bear's broad side. The distance was too short to miss. Ethan's breath caught. "Move," he rasped, though the bear couldn't hear the word so much as the fear in it. She didn't turn. Her attention was fixed on the man with the trap, who was inching closer again. The rifle fired. The grizzly jerked, her hind leg buckling beneath her. She collapsed for a heartbeat before surging up again on raw instinct and will. Ethan's vision blurred with panic. The deer bolted across the clearing in a blur of pale limbs. It crashed into the tall poacher's side, just enough to break his stance. The second shot went wide, hissing past the grizzly's shoulder and burying itself in the trunk beside Ethan's head. The poacher cursed and swung the rifle like a club, but the deer was already gone, darting back into the shadows at the clearing's edge. The grizzly limped now, her flank slick with blood, breath coming harder. But she didn't retreat. She advanced. Slow, deliberate. Every step a vow. The remaining poachers hesitated, fear worming into whatever bravado they had carried into the woods. The man with the trap crawled backward again. The tall one lifted his rifle for a third shot, but his hands trembled and his aim faltered. Ethan twisted once more, pouring strength he didn't have into the rope. Something tore. Rope, skin, maybe both, and the knot loosened. Not enough to free him, but enough to shift him lower down the trunk. He grit his teeth, sweat cold along his temples. If he could move just another inch... The bear lunged. The poacher fired. The shot struck her thigh. Not deep, but enough to stagger her. She crashed into the man, sending him sprawling. The rifle flew from his grip, skidding across the dirt until it struck a stone and stopped. Ethan swallowed hard. She was bleeding badly now, her leg shaking under her weight. But she still stood between him and danger, refusing to yield even as strength drained from her. The second poacher finally found his footing and ran. The tall one crawled after him. The third disappeared into the trees, crashing through brush in blind fear. Their retreat wasn't organized. It was desperate, frantic, the way men run from a truth too large to face. Silence seeped back into the clearing, punctuated only by the bear's labored breathing and Ethan's ragged attempts to draw in air. The deer emerged from the shadows once more, stepping carefully toward the wounded grizzly. It lowered its head, ears twitching, as if torn between instinct and gratitude. The bear sank to her haunches. Ethan's chest tightened. She had fought for him with a force that defied reason. And now she trembled with exhaustion, blood darkening the dirt beneath her. He pressed his head against the trunk, swallowing the ache in his throat. If he didn't get free soon, she would fall there, spent and alone. The knot at his wrist slipped again. He pushed, twisted, pulled. Each motion flared pain, but he didn't stop. Because across the clearing, she lifted her head to look at him, and in that gaze lived the same fragile, stubborn hope he had seen years ago in a frightened yearling he had carried through the snow. And he would not let that hope die tonight. The clearing lay in a bruised silence, thick with the smell of gunpowder and turned earth. The last of the poachers had vanished into the trees, their footsteps swallowed by distance, leaving only the cold night and the tremor of a wounded grizzly fighting to stay upright. Ethan felt the forest settle again, as if waiting to see whether life or loss would claim what remained. He braced himself against the trunk and pulled, twisting his shoulder hard. The rope, frayed from the bear's relentless work, slipped one last inch. His right wrist tore free, then the left, and he staggered forward, legs stiff and shaking from hours of confinement. The grizzly lifted her head, the movement slow, heavy, as though it cost her something essential. Her flank was soaked with dark blood that glistened in the thin moonlight. She swayed. Ethan rushed toward her, nearly falling when his knees buckled, but he caught himself and kept going. He could hear her breathing, short, rough, like a bellows failing in the cold. She turned her gaze toward him, not pleading, not afraid, but holding the same unspoken trust she had shown when she was small enough to fit across his arms. "Easy," he murmured, though his own voice trembled. "I've got you now." He knelt beside her, hands shaking as he touched the wound. The heat radiating from her body was intense, a furnace of muscle and instinct that had nearly gone out on his behalf. He pressed a hand gently against the torn flesh, gauging depth. She flinched, but didn't pull away. Nearby, the mule deer stepped from the edge of the clearing, watching with an alertness that felt almost protective. It stood as still as carved wood, ears angled toward every sound, guarding the moment. Ethan scanned the ground for the pack he'd seen one of the poachers drop earlier. Spotting it beneath a broken branch, he crawled to it and tugged it free. Inside were ammunition, a flashlight, and, thank God, a small first aid kit. He grabbed it and returned to the bear, lowering himself to the dirt beside her. She kept her head lifted, tracking his movement with steady eyes. "This might hurt," he said softly, "but it'll help." He cleaned the wound first, wiping blood with gauze soaked in antiseptic. The bear growled low in her throat, a rumble that shimmered through the ground, but she didn't strike. Ethan worked carefully, his breath fogging in the cold as he removed a small fragment of metal lodged near the edge of the wound. She shuddered. He whispered something without thinking, words meant for injured deer, for frightened cubs, for anything wild enough to fear touch. And somehow, impossibly, she quieted. When the bleeding slowed, he wrapped the bandage firmly around her thigh. She lifted her head a little higher, sniffing the air as though checking the perimeter herself. The deer shifted closer, hooves crunching lightly against the soil. It was an odd tableau. Prey and predator, both watching over a man who had once saved them from winter's cruelty. If anyone had told Ethan this would be his night, he wouldn't have believed a single breath of it. The bear tested her weight, trying to rise. Ethan steadied her shoulder. She grunted, more annoyed than pained, and pushed harder. Slowly, tremulously, she stood. Her injured leg shook, but held. Ethan rose with her, one hand on her fur, which was warm and coarse beneath his palm. For a moment, man and bear simply stood together in the dim clearing, the forest around them holding its breath. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "Again." She lowered her head until her nose brushed lightly against his shoulder. The gesture was brief, gentle, nothing like the ferocity she had shown in the fight. It was an acknowledgement. A thread passed between them, tying past to present. Ethan swallowed against the tightness in his throat. The deer snorted softly, alerting them to something in the brush. Ethan tensed, but no danger emerged. Instead, out from the shadows stepped a small shape, dark and uncertain, ears perked high. A cub. It blinked up at the world with the curiosity only the very young carry. Ethan's breath caught. He hadn't realized the grizzly was a mother. The cub approached its wounded parent, nudging her side. She lowered her head and chuffed softly, reassuring it. The sight struck Ethan deeper than any wound tonight. A wild creature who had come to pay a debt of kindness had brought her own young into a battlefield, not for violence, but to teach something the forest itself remembered. The grizzly turned back toward Ethan. Her eyes lingered on him for a long, steady moment, as if imprinting him into whatever memory animals keep. Something beyond words, older than gratitude. Then she nudged the cub gently, guiding it toward the dark corridor between the trees. The deer moved aside, giving them passage. Ethan watched as the two bears walked into the shadows, the mother limping but proud, the cub stepping carefully over every fallen branch. Just before the forest swallowed them, the grizzly paused and looked back one final time. Her gaze held no question, no fear, only the quiet truth that kindness, once given, travels farther than any of them could walk. Then she disappeared into the pines, her child following in her slow, sure footsteps. Ethan stood alone in the clearing, the bandage wrappers scattered at his feet, the rope lying broken beside the scarred trunk. The deer remained a moment longer, watching him with calm, dark eyes. When it finally turned and slipped into the underbrush, the night grew still again. He took a long breath of cold mountain air and let it out slowly. The forest, for all its danger and darkness, had shown him a grace few humans ever witnessed. The bear had repaid her debt. The deer had risked its life to distract a bullet. And somehow, in the blood and fear and moonlit chaos, he had been reminded why he walked these woods in the first place, to protect the wild, yes, but also to believe in the fragile bonds that sometimes form between worlds not meant to touch. As he limped toward the direction of his truck, dawn began its first pale climb over the ridge. The clearing behind him held the evidence of a battle no one would ever fully understand, except the ones who had fought in it. And somewhere in the distance, a cub chirped softly, echoing a legacy of kindness returning home. If this story touched your heart even a little, I'd love to hear from you. Just leave a simple comment, even a 0 or 1, to let me know you're here and still enjoying these peaceful journeys with us. Your voice helps this little channel stay alive, and it tells me you'd like more stories of courage, kindness, and the unexpected bonds between people and the wild. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and stay with us for the next chapter of these unbelievable wilderness tales. There are many more heartwarming stories waiting for you.